Margaret Jennings walked onto the Family Feud stage in a mint green cardigan and flat shoes. 68 years old, a hospice nurse from Topeka, Kansas, and by the 43rd minute of taping, she had said something so quiet into a handheld microphone that the audience barely heard it. But Steve Harvey heard it, and Steve Harvey looked at her for a long moment. And then he did something he had never done in 15 years of hosting Family Feud. He handed his card stack to the floor director. He unclipped his lavalier microphone. He set it on the podium. He walked off the stage without saying a word. And he did not come back for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. A stagehand later said that Steve Harvey walked through the back hallway of the studio, past the dressing rooms, out a side door, and stood in the alley next to a dumpster, with his hands on his knees, like a man who had just finished running a race. When he walked back in, his eyes were red, and he walked over to Margaret Jennings, and he took both of her hands in his, and he said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I needed a minute. You just told me what my mother was trying to tell me the day she died, and I wasn't ready to hear it then. Thank you for telling me now." Margaret Jennings, who did not understand yet what she had just done, squeezed his hands gently and said, "Honey, that's what we do. We tell you what your people were trying to say." It was April 8th, 2026, a Wednesday taping at the Atlanta studio, the third episode scheduled for the day. The Jennings family had driven in from Topeka, Kansas, in a rented minivan, 11 hours on I-70 and I-75. The family at the red podium was Margaret, her husband Bill, who was a retired mail carrier, her daughter Claire, who was a third-grade teacher, Claire's husband Doug, and Margaret's younger brother Richard, who had driven up from Wichita to join them. The competing family was the Adewale family from Silver Spring, Maryland, 5 members led by a Nigerian-American grandmother named Grace, who had immigrated to the United States in 1978 and who had worked as a labor and delivery nurse for 36 years. It was supposed to be a regular taping. The producers had been charmed by the Jennings family in the audition tape. They had been especially charmed by Margaret, who had answered the question, "What do you do for a living?" with the sentence, "I sit with people while they die." The producers had known she was a hospice nurse. The producers had not known how many people she had sat with. The producers had not asked. But nobody in that studio knew what was about to happen. Margaret Jennings had been born in 1958 in a farmhouse outside Emporia, Kansas, the second of 5 children, to a wheat farmer named Harold and a homemaker named Ruth. She had grown up on that farm, had graduated from Emporia High School in 1976, had met Bill Jennings at a church dance in the spring of her senior year, and had married him the following November. She had gone to nursing school at Washburn University in Topeka on a part-time schedule while working as a checker at a grocery store, and she had graduated in 1984 at the age of 26. She had taken a job at a small community hospital in Topeka, working medical surgical, and for the first 10 years of her career, she had done what most young nurses do: rotated through floors, learned the rhythms of the work, built up her endurance. She had raised her daughter Claire alongside the work. She had been a quiet nurse, a steady one, not flashy, not ambitious for titles, the kind of nurse who knew the first names of the janitors and the cafeteria workers and remembered their birthdays. In 1996, Margaret Jennings had made a decision that changed the rest of her career. Her mother, Ruth, had died that spring of pancreatic cancer. At home, in a hospital bed that had been set up in the living room of the farmhouse outside Emporia. The hospice nurse, who had cared for Ruth in her final 3 weeks, had been a woman named Betty Sorensen, a tall, lean woman in her 50s who had walked into the farmhouse with a quiet brown leather bag and had sat down at the kitchen table with Harold and Margaret and had explained what dying was going to look like. in plain, simple English, and had held Ruth's hand through most of the last 18 hours of her life. Margaret Jennings had watched Betty Sorensen work. She had watched the way Betty talked to her mother when her mother could no longer talk back. She had watched the way Betty cleaned her mother's face. She had watched the way Betty whispered to Ruth at 2:17 in the morning, "Ruth, honey, it's okay to go now. Your family is going to be all right. I'll make sure of it." Ruth had died at 2:34 a.m. Margaret Jennings had driven back to Topeka 3 days later and had applied for a position in the hospice service of her hospital. She had started the following month. She had been a hospice nurse for the next 30 years. What Margaret Jennings had done across those 30 years was sit with dying people. That was the job. She had driven to houses and apartments and nursing homes and trailers and farmhouses across eastern Kansas, and she had sat with dying people. She had held hands. She had cleaned faces. She had repositioned bodies. She had administered morphine in carefully measured doses to keep people comfortable when comfort was all that was left. She had listened. Mostly, she had listened. Because the thing Margaret Jennings had learned in her first month as a hospice nurse, the thing Betty Sorensen had taught her by example, was that dying people almost always had one last thing they were trying to say. Sometimes it took them days to get it out. Sometimes they said it in fragments. Sometimes they said it once, clearly, and then slipped away. But they almost always had it. A message, a confession, a piece of peace they needed to hand to somebody. And a hospice nurse, Betty had taught her, is the person who makes sure it gets handed over. Margaret Jennings had sat with, by her own count, approximately 1,840 dying people across 30 years. She had heard almost 1,840 last things. She had heard a World War II veteran in Manhattan, Kansas, in 2003 whisper the name of a man he had served with in Italy, a man who had died in Margaret's patient's arms in 1944, and ask Margaret to write the name down and send it to the man's widow, who was still alive in Ohio. Margaret had written it down. Margaret had mailed the letter. The widow had written back. She had heard a young mother in Lawrence, Kansas in 2011, dying of breast cancer at 34, whisper to Margaret that she wanted her 7-year-old daughter to know that it was okay to forget her sometimes. "I don't want her to carry me around like a weight," the mother had said. "I want her to be light." Margaret had repeated those words 12 years later at the daughter's wedding, when the daughter had asked Margaret to speak. And that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. She had heard an old woman in a nursing home in Emporia in 2019 say her husband's name, who had died in 1962, 6 times in a row, quietly, almost smiling, like she could see him in the doorway. She had heard a father in Salina in 2022 tell his son who was sitting by the bed holding his hand, "I forgive you. Whatever you did, whatever you think I was mad about, I forgive you. Don't carry it." The son had sobbed because the son had been estranged from his father for 11 years over something the father had apparently forgotten. Margaret Jennings had written down, in a series of small notebooks that she kept in a drawer in her bedroom, every last thing she had ever heard. She had 17 notebooks. She had started the habit in her first year because she had wanted to honor the weight of what people were handing her. She had never shown the notebooks to anyone, not even her husband, Bill. She had told her daughter Claire, once, that the notebooks existed, and Claire had asked to read them, and Margaret had said, "Baby, those aren't mine to share. I'm just keeping them until I figure out what to do with them." Margaret Jennings had retired from hospice nursing in December 2025 at the age of 67, after 30 years. Her last patient, had been a man named Leonard Hayes, 89 years old, a retired insurance agent in Topeka, who had held her hand on a Thursday evening in early December and had said, "Margaret, I have been trying to figure out for 3 weeks what I wanted to tell my family, and I think I finally have it. Tell them that the best part of my life was not the part I was most proud of. Tell them the best part was the ordinary part, the part I didn't even notice while it was happening." Leonard Hayes had died 90 minutes later. Margaret had delivered his message to his family the following afternoon. Then she had gone home, had told Bill she was done, and had hung up her stethoscope on a hook by the back door. Her daughter Claire had applied to Family Feud as a retirement present. The family had practiced for 6 weeks in Margaret's living room. Margaret had agreed to come because her whole family was excited, and because she had never been on an airplane. They were driving, but still, she had never been to Atlanta, and because after 30 years of sitting in rooms with dying people, she thought a game show might be a nice change of pace. The main game was unremarkable and delightful in equal measure. The Jennings family was quiet funny, the kind of funny that sneaks up on you, and the Adewale family was warm funny, the kind of funny that comes out of a very large multi-generational dinner table. The score was close through 3 rounds. Going into the 4th round, Steve Harvey, who had been doing this job for 15 years and who had a good ear for which contestants carried something under the surface, had started to notice Margaret Jennings. He had noticed the way she answered questions. He had noticed the way she looked at her husband Bill when Bill got a laugh. He had noticed that when Steve had asked her, in the opening segment, what she did for a living, she had said, "I was a hospice nurse for 30 years. I retired in December." And Steve had said, "Ma'am, that is one of the hardest jobs in the world." And Margaret had said quietly, "Oh, honey, it's not hard. It's a privilege." Steve had remembered that answer. He had remembered it for 43 minutes. In the 4th round, one of the survey questions was, "Name something a dying person might say to a family member." It was a standard Family Feud question, played for laughs, the kind of thing where the top answers were things like, "I love you," and "Forgive me," and "Take care of your mother." The Adewale family went first. They got "I love you" for 38 points. They got "Goodbye" for 21. They got "I'm sorry" for 18. They got 1 wrong answer, strike 1. Then Steve turned to the Jennings family. Margaret was the one at the buzzer. Steve said, "Margaret, let's steal this one. Name something a dying person might say to a family member." Margaret Jennings paused. The studio was mostly quiet, the way studios get during fast money-adjacent moments, and the audience was leaning forward a little. Margaret Jennings said, into the handheld microphone, quietly, "I'm not afraid." The survey board lit up. "I'm not afraid" had been the number 2 answer. 41 points. The Jennings family won the round and the steal and the remaining game. But Steve Harvey had not moved. He was standing at center stage, holding his card stack, looking at Margaret Jennings. The floor director counted him down to the commercial break. Steve did not start the commercial read. He looked at Margaret a moment longer, and then he said, off script, into his microphone, "Ma'am, is that what they say?" Margaret Jennings looked up at him. "What, honey?" "The ones you sat with, at the end. Is that what they say?" Margaret Jennings thought about it for a moment. She said, "A lot of them, yes. More than you would expect. They say it to the family, but I think they're also saying it to themselves, like they're practicing. 'I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.' A lot of them say it 2 or 3 times in the last hour." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey stood there, and something happened to his face that the crew had not seen before. It was not a break. It was not a cry. It was a smaller thing, a private thing, a recognition. He said, very quietly, almost to himself, "My mother said that to me. The last thing she said. She said, 'Stevie, I'm not afraid.'" Margaret Jennings nodded slowly. "Well, Mr. Harvey, I believe she meant it. I thought she was trying to comfort me. I thought she was saying it for me. Sometimes they are, honey, but usually it's both. Usually they're saying it so you know that they know. So you know they're not scared, so you can stop being scared for them. And so they can hear themselves say it out loud one more time." Steve Harvey stood at center stage and stared at the back of the studio. Then he handed his card stack to the floor director. He unclipped his lavalier microphone. He set it on the podium. He walked off the stage without saying a word. In the control room, Denise Coleman later said, "There was a moment of genuine panic. She made a decision. She kept the cameras rolling. She held the commercial break. She sent a note to the floor director that read, 'Wait.' A stagehand watching from the wings saw Steve walk through the back hallway, past the dressing rooms, past the makeup room, through a side door, and into the alley where the dumpsters were kept. Steve Harvey stood in the alley with his hands on his knees for 90 seconds. Then he straightened up, and he walked back inside, and he stood in the hallway for another 2 minutes and 21 seconds with one hand flat against the cinder block wall. When he walked back onto the stage, 4 minutes and 11 seconds had passed, and his eyes were red. He walked over to Margaret Jennings. He took both of her hands in his. He said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I needed a minute. You just told me what my mother was trying to tell me the day she died, and I wasn't ready to hear it then. Thank you for telling me now." Margaret Jennings squeezed his hands gently. "Honey, that's what we do. We tell you what your people were trying to say." Steve Harvey began to cry. He did not try to hide it. He stood in the center of the stage, holding the hands of a 68-year-old hospice nurse from Topeka, Kansas, and he cried the way a grown man cries when something he has been carrying for a long time finally gets set down. But Steve wasn't done. He wiped his face. He turned to the camera. He said, "I want to talk to everybody watching at home. 26 years ago, my mother died, and the last thing she said to me was, 'Stevie, I'm not afraid.' And for 26 years, I have thought she was trying to make me feel better. I have carried that around like a weight, because I was thinking, she's saying that because I'm upset. She's saying that because I can't handle this. And this woman right here, this Margaret Jennings, just told me something that I should have known 26 years ago. My mama wasn't afraid. My mama was telling me she wasn't afraid because she wasn't afraid. Not for me. For her. She had peace. And I have been crying about her being brave for me, when all along she was just telling me something true about herself. And that changes. Y'all, that changes everything." Steve paused. He looked at Margaret. 30 years ago, I was living in my 1976 Ford Tempo. I was at the bottom of the world. Nobody helped me at my lowest. I promised God, if He got me out of that car, I would spend the rest of my life helping people. And I have tried. Lord knows I have tried. But Margaret Jennings, you did something today that I didn't even know I needed. You didn't help me up out of a car. You helped me put down a rock I've been carrying for 26 years. Ma'am, I was you. I was trying to interpret my mama's last words for 26 years, and you just told me what they meant." The studio fell completely silent. Bill Jennings, Margaret's husband of 49 years, was wiping his eyes at the podium. Their daughter Claire had both hands over her face. Grace Adewale, the Nigerian-American grandmother at the blue podium, had tears running down her face too, and she was nodding slowly, the way a nurse nods when another nurse has done the thing nurses do. But Steve wasn't done. He pulled out his phone, his actual phone. He said to Margaret, "Ma'am, are those notebooks real?" Margaret Jennings blinked. "What notebooks, honey? Your daughter told my producer in the pre-interview that you keep notebooks. 30 years of last words. Is that real?" Margaret looked at her daughter. Claire looked a little sheepish. Margaret looked back at Steve. "Yes, sir. 17 of them." Steve Harvey nodded. He dialed a number. He put it on speaker. "Simon & Schuster, this is Patricia." "Patricia, this is Steve Harvey. I need to speak with your head of non-fiction acquisitions. It's important." 3 minutes later, a woman named Dana Brockman came on the line. Steve said, "Dana, I'm on the Family Feud stage with a 68-year-old woman named Margaret Jennings. She was a hospice nurse for 30 years in eastern Kansas. She kept notebooks. Every last thing anybody said to her before they died. 17 notebooks, 30 years. About 1,840 people. Dana, I want you to publish this book. I will personally fund the advance. I want Margaret Jennings to decide which words get shared and which ones stay hers. And I want the proceeds to go to a new foundation we're starting tonight. Can your team be in Topeka, Kansas on Friday?" Dana Brockman was quiet for a moment. She said, "Mr. Harvey, we can be there Friday, if Mrs. Jennings agrees." Steve looked at Margaret. "Ma'am, what do you think?" Margaret Jennings looked at her husband. She looked at her daughter. She looked at her hands, which had held almost 2,000 dying hands. She said quietly, I think there's an awful lot of people out there who are wondering what their people were trying to tell them. I think maybe some of those messages were meant for more than one family." Steve said to Dana, "Friday, Topeka. My office will coordinate." He hung up. He turned to the camera. "Tonight I am announcing the Last Thing Foundation. The mission is simple. We are going to fund hospice nurses across the country. We are going to cover their continuing education. We are going to give them grants for the uncovered hours they work. We are going to pay for grief counseling for the families they serve. Because in this country we pay the people who save lives, and we forget about the people who walk people home. And those are the same people, y'all. A hospice nurse is a nurse. She's just the nurse at the other end of the hallway. And tonight, I'm saying her name out loud." Grace Adewale walked across the stage to Margaret Jennings. She took Margaret's hand. She said, in her Nigerian-accented English, "Sister, I delivered babies for 36 years. You sent people home for 30 years. We are the same. We are bookends. Tonight, I am bowing to you because I was always a little afraid of your end of the hallway." She bowed her head. Margaret pressed her forehead gently against Grace's. Both families won $20,000. Steve covered it personally. The tape rolled for another 29 minutes. Family Feud aired the unedited segment as a 1-hour primetime special on May 3, 2026. The clip of Steve saying, "You helped me put down a rock I've been carrying for 26 years," hit 160 million views across platforms in the first 48 hours. By the end of the first week, it was at 320 million. By the end of the month, it had crossed 450 million. The hashtag #LastThingFoundation trended for 10 consecutive days. A woman in Seattle posted a video of herself sitting at her kitchen table with an old voicemail from her deceased father playing on her phone. A voicemail she had saved for 11 years but had never been able to listen to all the way through. And this time, she listened to the whole thing. That video crossed 29 million views. The comments section filled for days, with strangers typing out what their people had said at the end. The Last Thing Foundation was formally incorporated within 3 weeks. In its first 6 months of operation, it provided grants to 3,800 hospice nurses across 46 states for continuing education, mental health support, and uncompensated overtime. It funded grief counseling for 14,600 bereaved families. Steve Harvey personally donated $8 million in the first month. The public contributed another $51 million by the end of the year. Margaret Jennings' book, The Last Thing, edited by Margaret and Claire together, was published by Simon & Schuster on September 8, 2026. It debuted at number 1 on the New York Times non-fiction bestseller list. Margaret donated 100% of her royalties to the Last Thing Foundation. The book was reviewed by a hospice chaplain in The Atlantic, who wrote that Margaret Jennings had done something that had not been done in American non-fiction in a generation. She had let ordinary, dying people speak in their own words about the thing that terrifies everyone. In a CBS Sunday Morning interview in June 2026, Steve Harvey was asked what he had been thinking during the 4 minutes he was gone from the stage. He said, "I was thinking about my mama. I was thinking about her bedroom. I was thinking about her face. And I was thinking that for 26 years I had been getting something wrong, and a stranger from Kansas had just set me right with one sentence. And I was thinking that I needed to stand in an alley for a minute and let my mama hear me say, 'Thank you.'" In April 2026, Margaret Jennings sat at her kitchen table in Topeka, Kansas, with a pot of coffee and 17 small notebooks stacked in front of her, and she began the slow work of reading through 30 years of last words to decide which ones to share. Her husband Bill sat across from her, drinking coffee, reading the Topeka Capital Journal, not saying much, the way he had sat across from her for 49 years. At one point, Margaret looked up from a notebook and she said, "Bill!" Bill looked up. "When it's my turn, will you write mine down?" Bill Jennings set his newspaper down. He took his wife's hand across the kitchen table. He said, "Maggie, I've been writing yours down for 49 years. Some hospice nurses spend 30 years carrying other people's last words without ever knowing who else needed to hear them. And some hospice nurses, if they are very lucky, live long enough to hand those words to a whole country at the same time. If this story reached you tonight, do this one thing. Hit subscribe, tap the bell, and in the comments, write the last thing someone said to you before they passed. Or, if you don't have one, write the word listening, because somebody in those comments has been waiting 30 years to share theirs, and has just been waiting for somebody to listen.